Hey there! Today, in this video, we will go through horrific moments where Karens meet wild animals. From a Karen that did not listen to a tour guide, to a Karen that thought she was safe approaching a bear. It was August 14th, 2017, on the southwestern fringe of the Serengeti. For Selena Mero, the day began with an argument about camp rules and a sun that hadn't yet finished setting. She had no idea that the real cost was still days away. Selena Mero had built a small following by reviewing restaurants across Southeast Asia and coastal Australia through short, contemptuous videos on YouTube. A travel outlet had commissioned her for a piece on safari camp food, the gap between what operators advertised and what actually arrived on the plate. She had called the pitch Safari Theater. She flew into Arusha on August 11th and reached the camp by land on the 13th. By the evening of her first full day, it looked like the Karen in her was already coming in hot. She had argued twice with the camp manager, once about dinner service timing, once about the prohibition on personal food inside tents. She considered the policy performative. That night she brought 3 protein bars, dried mango, and a sealed container of mixed nuts into her tent. In a message sent to a friend at 6:42 p.m., she described it as a small act of protest. Staff had repositioned and relatched all food storage bins that afternoon. 2 separate guests had reported lion tracks in the dry watercourse before sunset. Lions are not common immediately adjacent to tented camps in this corridor, but they are not unknown. A male lion averages 400 pounds, a female 280. Their canine teeth apply over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. They can tear through heavy canvas with a single claw hook. The camp also sat along a known game trail used by migrating wildebeest and zebra during dry periods, which occasionally brought predators closer to human structures after dark. The senior guide, Festus, who had worked that corridor for 9 years, conducted a walkthrough of the tent row at roughly 5:15 p.m. and spoke to at least 2 guests about keeping tent flaps fully sealed and zipped. He did not speak to Selena. Her tent light was on when he passed, but he was immediately shooed away when she heard him walking closer. Footage from a camp exterior camera showed a single female lion entering the camp perimeter from the dry watercourse side at 6:51 p.m. Her movement was slow and cautious, stopping multiple times to look toward nearby tents and listen. She moved low, shoulders rolling, head extended, and was nearly silent. Investigators later believed the lion had likely been following scent trails from improperly discarded cooking scraps near the staff preparation area earlier that evening, and Selena's occupied tent was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The lion lingered around the outer edge of camp for several minutes before approaching Selena's tent. The first contact is audible before it is visible, a heavy inhalation, then the sudden rip of canvas as a claw hooked through the tent wall just above Selena's sleeping pad. She shouted twice, sharp and rising. She opened the inner flap outward, and immediately the lion's head filled the opening. What followed is partially captured on 2 separate recordings and took under 2 minutes. Selena was pulled forward, her shoulder wedging against the tent frame. The lion appeared startled once Selena began screaming, but continued swiping and biting during the confusion at the tent entrance. She was bitten a minimum of 4 times, the right forearm, the left hand, a deep raking bite across her ribs. But the 5th bite, a sustained clamp to the lateral neck, severed her right carotid artery. Other guests began throwing boots, water bottles, and a folding camp chair. Festus arrived with a flare gun at approximately the 90-second mark and discharged it twice skyward. The lion flinched, but did not immediately release. The lion dragged her another 3 feet before the second flare caused it to back away. Selena remained on the ground. Medical staff arrived 25 minutes later and found no vital signs. Her funeral was a sparse affair in her hometown of Perth, attended by a few bewildered relatives. Selena's death wasn't a tragedy of wilderness. It was a tragedy of performance, where the real lion wasn't the one with teeth, but the one she'd been trying to starve in herself all along. It was August 14th, 2015, in a local zoo in Knoxville, Tennessee. Summer humidity clung to the concrete walkways as visitors moved through the big cat section under a clear sky. A male Amur tiger paced inside his enclosure, occasionally passing near the viewing fence as guests paused to watch. 47-year-old Darlene Hust had driven to Bramblewood with her younger sister Wren after a tense argument earlier that morning. She worked the front desk at a dental office and was known among friends for being firm in her opinions once she settled on them. She often described animals in human terms, sometimes saying she believed they could sense emotional states. She had also developed a habit of interpreting animal behavior as personal expression rather than instinct. The Amur tiger, Cossack, was one of the zoo's adult males, weighing roughly 430 pounds. He was documented as healthy and behaviorally stable, with no prior history of aggression toward barriers or staff. After arriving at the exhibit, they followed the public path toward a side viewing area next to a staff-only corridor. The corridor was clearly marked off limits, but a maintenance gate leading into a keeper area had been left unlocked that morning during routine cleaning. Darlene entered the service corridor first, assuming it was part of a secondary viewing area. Wren followed a few steps behind. From there, Darlene pushed open the unlatched internal gate, stepping past a boundary that led into a narrow keeper transition space bordering the tiger enclosure. Unlike the main public viewing area, this zone was protected only by a single chain link barrier and was not intended for visitor access. It doesn't look dangerous at first. That's the part I think people underestimate. At the edge of the enclosure, Cossack was resting, but alert. The moment Darlene approached the fence and extended her hand toward it, the tiger reacted to the sudden movement at close range. He surged forward and struck the chain link barrier with his forelimbs, causing Darlene's arm and upper body to be forced against the fencing. The impact drove her shoulder into the metal mesh. She sustained a fractured clavicle and a shoulder dislocation from the sudden lateral force. A deep laceration opened along her forearm, where a claw passed through the chain link during the strike. Wren shouted for her to move back, but the confined space limited her ability to pull Darlene away quickly. As Darlene tried to withdraw her arm, Cossack struck again through the barrier, hooking his claws into the upper portion of her arm and pulling her closer to the fence. The resulting force caused additional trauma to the shoulder complex, including likely soft tissue and nerve injury, consistent with severe blunt force traction. Darlene lost her footing on the uneven ground of the service corridor, collapsing against the base of the fence. At that moment, the unsecured internal gate behind her remained open, and she fell backward through it into the enclosure's inner boundary area. Now, inside the enclosure space, separation from the tiger was no longer protected by the primary visitor barrier. Cossack closed the distance within seconds and bit into her right thigh. The bite force caused a severe, comminuted fracture of the femur, along with extensive soft tissue crushing. The animal tightened its grip and shook her, which caused more internal damage and rapid blood loss. She lost consciousness shortly after the attack escalated. In situations like that, it's no longer about fixing what already happened. It's just about trying to get things under control. Zoo staff immediately went into emergency lockdown as soon as the breach was noticed. A keeper radioed for full containment while others moved in to secure the area. A deterrent hose was deployed from an elevated position in an attempt to push the animal back, but it did not disengage or leave the area. Knoxville EMS was dispatched at once, but was held outside the perimeter until the enclosure was confirmed secure. Once responders were allowed entry, Darlene Hust was already deceased. The medical examiner attributed the death to catastrophic blood loss from severe traumatic injuries, including major vascular damage to the thigh and blunt force trauma to the upper body. An internal investigation later confirmed that the incident resulted from unauthorized entry into a restricted keeper transition zone and the failure to secure an internal service gate. The primary enclosure barriers were found to be structurally intact. Following the incident, the zoo implemented revised protocols requiring secondary locking systems on all internal staff gates and reinforced access controls between service corridors and animal-adjacent zones. Cossack was retained in captivity. As investigators concluded, the attack was a direct consequence of human entry into a restricted area rather than a breach of enclosure integrity. It was September 6, 2016. The wetland preserve sat on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, a privately run operation offering guided walking and kayak tours through a network of marsh channels and interconnected lagoons. The Eastern Lagoon was the largest body of water on the property and the most heavily populated with alligators. Phyllis Halcomb was 50 years old. She was a retired insurance adjuster from Baton Rouge who had spent her whole life near wetland environments and somewhere along the way had decided that counted as expertise. She grew up near bayous, had been around alligators her whole life, and made sure the group knew that during the pre-tour briefing. The problem with growing up around something dangerous and never getting hurt by it is that eventually you stop believing it can hurt you at all. American alligators are apex predators common throughout the southeastern United States. Adult males reach up to 15 feet in length and around 1,000 pounds. They are ambush predators. They sit still, stay concealed, and wait. At dusk, their ability to detect movement in low light makes them significantly harder to spot before it is too late. An attack starts with a fast surface lunge, a bite, and an immediate pull underwater. The death roll happens below the surface, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The group reached the Eastern Lagoon platform at around 6:10 p.m. The light was already going flat. The guide counted 4 alligators visible from the platform, 2 near the far bank, 1 on a mud flat to the east, and 1 that had been sitting near the platform side bank earlier, but was no longer visible. He pointed that last one out to the group. Not seeing it did not mean it had left. Phyllis had been quiet for most of the walk out. On the platform, she made up for it. She told the group alligators were slow and predictable. She said the restricted zone was excessive for anyone with basic common sense. She said she had walked bayou banks her entire life and never had a single problem, as though a lifetime without incident was proof of immunity rather than luck. The guide reminded the group they would be moving on in about 15 minutes and left her to it. At the 12-minute mark, he moved to the rear of the platform to answer questions from 2 other guests. He had his back to the lagoon for about 3 minutes. When he turned around, Phyllis was gone. She had gone down the side access steps and unlatched the gate at the bottom. She was crouching at the water's edge about 8 feet from the base of the steps, phone out, facing the lagoon. The light was low and orange by then. The water surface was dark. He called her name and moved toward the steps. The alligator had been in the water near the platform side bank the entire time. It came up fast, a surface lunge that cleared the waterline in a single motion. The bite closed on her right forearm as she instinctively raised it, and the animal's momentum drove her forward off the bank and into the water. She was under 2 seconds. The water settled almost immediately. He reached the bank within seconds, but there was nothing to see. A call went out to the preserve's main facility right away. The response team reached the Eastern Lagoon about 34 minutes later. They searched until dark and resumed at first light. Phyllis Halcom's body was recovered the following morning, 19 hours after the attack, in about 5 feet of water near the far bank under submerged vegetation. The post-mortem confirmed she drowned. The initial bite had fractured her right forearm and 3 ribs. The injuries to her arm and torso showed the animal had death rolled with her underwater before releasing. The access gate was found open. The death was recorded as accidental. Contributing factors listed were unauthorized descent from the observation platform and deliberate approach to the water within a restricted zone at dusk. It was September 22, 2015, and the Ugandan sun beat down on the shrinking waterways surrounding Lake Mburo, where the dry season had compressed hippo populations into increasingly crowded channels. A small ecotourism operation offered morning boat excursions along a network of papyrus-lined channels, guided by locally trained operators. Beverlyn Treadworth was a 52-year-old property litigation attorney from Surrey, England, who had arrived in Uganda as part of a 3-week East African tour, organized through a London-based safari company. Treadworth's travel companion, a university friend, had quietly switched to a separate room at the previous lodge after growing exhausted by her behavior. Treadworth had already lodged complaints at 2 previous stops on the itinerary, one regarding bedsheet thread count and another accusing kitchen staff of ignoring dietary restrictions. The morning excursion departed in a small motorized skiff carrying Treadworth, a retired schoolteacher from Bruges, and a 25-year-old operator named Kamuntu Bwayo. Bwayo, certified by the National Wildlife Authority, briefed the group that hippopods would be observed from safe distance. Certain channels were off limits, and his navigation decisions were final. Treadworth began complaining when Bwayo maintained roughly 50 yards from the nearest pod. She pointed toward a narrow channel approximately 150 yards away, where at least 12 hippos were visible, including calves. She instructed Bwayo to enter the channel. Bwayo refused. The channel was shallow, narrow, and occupied by a dominant male he had personally observed displaying aggressive behavior on 3 previous excursions. Entering in a small skiff would place them within the male's defended territory, with no room to maneuver. Treadworth told Bwayo she would contact the National Wildlife Authority to report his refusal. She informed him that her professional connections in international tourism could ensure this operation never attracted another European client. When the retired schoolteacher suggested trusting the guide, Treadworth told her she had not asked for her opinion. Boyo held firm and began turning back toward the main channel. Treadworth stood abruptly, stepped toward the stern, and grabbed the tiller arm, wrenching the boat's direction toward the channel mouth and momentarily disrupting Boyo's control. He pulled her hand away, but the sudden course change had already swung the bow toward the entrance. The engine noise and abrupt vibration carried across the water. Hippopotamuses are one of the deadliest large animals in Africa by annual human fatalities. Adult males weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds and can reach up to 12 to 14 feet in length. Despite their bulk, hippos move through shallow water by bounding along the bottom with surprising speed, fast enough at close range that a human cannot react in time. Their jaws can open extremely wide, exposing massive tusk-like canines with one of the strongest bite forces of any land animal. Territorial males become extraordinarily aggressive during the dry season when shrinking water forces pods into increasingly confined space. The dominant male surfaced roughly 30 feet from the bow. Its scarred head and massive jaw rose above the waterline, mouth opening in a full threat gape. Boyo cut the engine immediately and attempted to reverse and angle the boat away from the channel. The bull submerged. Seconds of silence. Then the animal surfaced directly beside the skiff, its massive head striking the gunwale with tremendous force. The impact buckled the thin metal, and the bull's jaws clamped down and wrenched, capsizing the skiff and dumping all three occupants into shallow, murky water. Boyo grabbed the schoolteacher and hauled her toward the papyrus bank. Based on witness testimony, the bull charged through the shallows at devastating speed. Its jaws came down on Treadworth's midsection, biting and crushing before lifting and tossing her partially from the water with a violent wrench of its massive head. The bull retreated toward its pod. The attack lasted seconds. Boyo and the schoolteacher remained hidden in the papyrus until the pod settled. His radio call brought a rescue boat after a significant delay. Beverlyn Treadworth had died almost instantly from catastrophic bite trauma. The investigation determined she had physically seized boat controls against the operator's refusal, momentarily disrupting navigation and directing the vessel toward a territorial male. Boyo was cleared of liability. The incident was logged with the National Wildlife Authority. The operation temporarily reviewed excursion protocols and implemented reinforced tiller guards and a two-guide policy. It was July 2017 at a private safari lodge in Kenya. The camp sat in open bush, individual cabins spaced well apart, linked by dirt paths that disappeared into darkness after sunset. The lighting was low by design. The wildlife did not stop moving at night because the guests had gone to bed. Patricia Doyle was 35, a corporate consultant. 4 months before the trip, she had spent 6 weeks in hospital. A dispute with a senior colleague had turned physical. She had confronted him over what she believed was a deliberate effort to push her out, and the situation had escalated in a way that left her with a fractured cheekbone and 2 broken ribs. The colleague was disciplined. Patricia was put on leave. She did not describe any of it as a loss. She booked the Kenya trip 2 weeks after she was discharged. And I want to sit with that for a second, because that context matters. She had just been through something brutal, and she was not going to let it define her. I actually respect that. What comes next just makes it harder to listen to. She arrived on a Tuesday. The rules were explained before anyone unpacked. Stay inside after dark. No walking unescorted between sunset and sunrise. No food outside the cabins. Staff repeated them at check-in, printed them on a card left in every cabin, and went over them again at dinner. The rules were not suggestions. Hyenas were active in the area and were already familiar with the lodge perimeter. At dinner, a staff member spoke briefly about hyenas. He said they were bolder than most visitors expected. Patricia listened and said quietly but clearly enough for the table to hear that animals do not just attack for no reason, and that she had always been good at reading behavior. The other guests did not respond. The staff member did not engage further. And this is the part that gets me. This is exactly the kind of thing a person says right before they find out they were wrong. Patricia left her cabin at approximately 11 p.m. She was carrying leftover food she had brought back from dinner. She did not stop at the doorway. She walked several meters down the path, away from the cabin, away from the light. The scent moved quickly in the dark. A hyena appeared at the edge of visibility and stopped. Patricia saw it. She did not go back inside. Spotted hyenas have a bite force of over 1,100 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush bone completely. They are not scavengers by nature. In open bush, they are apex hunters that coordinate movement and close from multiple angles. The animal was at a distance, and she seemed to treat that distance as control. She had said at dinner that she knew how to read behavior. A second hyena appeared to the left, coming from a different direction. The two animals spread apart and began closing in from different angles, fluid and unhurried. Heads low, the food was still in her hand. The distance was closing. Patricia hesitated. Then she held her position instead of moving back. By the time she turned back toward the cabin, they were already close. The first hyena closed the last few meters quickly and hit her from the side, taking her off her feet. She went down hard. The second was already on her before she could orient herself, clamping onto her shoulder and pulling. A third came in from the direction of the food. Staff heard the disturbance and responded within minutes. Patricia Doyle was found unresponsive on the path outside her cabin. A paramedic team reached the scene shortly after and worked to stabilize her. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was recorded as severe trauma from multiple bite wounds to the neck, shoulder, and upper body, consistent with a hyena attack. Her body was transported back home and buried in a cemetery with only close friends in attendance. The lodge incident. Report noted that the rules had been explained at check-in, reinforced at dinner, and printed in every cabin, but ignored by Patricia. And the part that stays with me about Patricia Doyle is that she had just survived something really difficult. But the last decision she made was the one that undid all of it. It was October 28, 2018, and the subarctic tundra near Churchill stretched toward ice-free waters. During the pre-ice season, nutritionally stressed polar bears gathered in the area, increasing the risk of human encounters. Strict safety protocols were in place, but their effectiveness depended on visitor compliance. Natalia Cooper, 39, arrived days earlier, carrying the bitterness of a life recently upended. A former office manager, she had lost her job due to absenteeism and confrontational behavior, leading to eviction and the humiliating need to move back in with her mother. The Budget Polar Bear Adventure Tour represented her attempt to prove she could still manage independence, though fellow travelers quickly grew weary of her constant complaints about tour rules. Her presence had already created conflicts with the lead guide Tommy, whose family had lived in the area for generations. Natalia dismissed safety briefings as unnecessary theatrics, interpreting genuine warnings about bear behavior as personal slights. Her confrontational attitude alienated other tourists. Churchill's location on the western shore of Hudson Bay creates a unique situation where polar bears concentrate in unprecedented numbers during the pre-ice season from October through November. Adult male polar bears can exceed 1,500 pounds and possess bite forces of 1,200 pounds per square inch. But their primary danger during the pre-ice period stems from nutritional stress that drives increasingly desperate predatory behavior. Tommy had emphasized repeatedly that late October represented the most dangerous period for human-bear encounters, when nutritionally stressed bears lose their natural wariness of humans and begin exhibiting predatory hunting behaviors. The town had implemented strict protocols requiring tourists to travel in groups and avoid dawn or dusk activities when bear movement peaked. The evening before her death, Natalia had announced her intention to take an early morning solo walk to photograph the aurora borealis, dismissing Tommy's urgent warnings about bear activity during pre-dawn hours. When Tommy and other tour members strongly discouraged this plan, Natalia exploded in fury, accusing everyone of controlling her and treating her like a stupid American who couldn't handle basic outdoor activities. Despite explicit instructions prohibiting solo travel outside the lodge, Natalia left through a rear exit without notifying the guides. She walked along the perimeter road to photograph the aurora borealis. During this time, a male polar bear in the area, experiencing nutritional stress during the pre-ice season, was moving systematically through the outskirts and detected her presence. A nutritionally stressed male polar bear had been moving systematically through the outskirts, following scents that drew him toward areas with human activity. Unlike the defensive attacks typical of brown bears, polar bear predation during this pre-ice season represents calculated hunting behavior. Unlike other bears, polar bears are true carnivores with no fear of humans. They actively hunt people as prey when hungry. During the pre-ice season, after months without food, a starving polar bear views a lone human not as a threat to avoid, but as a meal to pursue. The bear detected Natalia's movement behind a storage shed and approached with the silent precision of an Arctic apex predator. The bear made contact from behind, and Natalia lost her balance, tumbling onto the snow-covered ground. The predator's massive jaws and weight caused immediate and severe injuries to her neck, shoulders, and upper torso, including deep puncture wounds, lacerations, and extensive soft tissue trauma. The force of the attack also inflicted blunt force trauma to her ribs and internal organs, while major blood vessels were severed, leading to rapid blood loss. As she struggled to regain her footing, the bear's grip prevented movement. The combination of crushing force, sharp bites, and sustained pressure overwhelmed her body's ability to respond. Despite attempts to move or cry out, Natalia became immobilized by the combination of trauma, shock, and hemorrhage. The polar bear did not disengage. It maintained control of her body, repositioning and dragging her several feet across the snow toward partial cover near the shed. Feeding behavior began shortly after she ceased resisting. The attack was sustained and methodical, consistent with predatory intent. A local worker observed the bear and notified regional wildlife authorities. The authorities arrived with deterrent equipment and were able to drive the bear away from the area. The post-mortem revealed massive trauma to the spine and skull consistent with a large predator attack, including crushing injuries and extensive tissue damage. Death resulted from catastrophic cervical spine trauma and neurogenic shock, compounded by severe blood loss. Wildlife authorities classified Natalia's death as a predatory attack during the pre-ice season. Her mother managed arrangements privately. The bear was tracked and euthanized shortly after in accordance with regional wildlife management protocols, as polar bears that carry out confirmed predatory attacks are not considered safe candidates for relocation. It was October 22, 2017. The walking safari route cut through a wide stretch of mixed woodland and grassland on a private reserve in southern Zimbabwe. The terrain was mostly flat, with dry riverbeds breaking it up every mile or so and patches of dense thicket pushing in from the sides. Vonnie Sears was 47 years old. She was a marketing director from Denver, Colorado, who had organized the entire 2-week trip herself and showed up to the pre-walk briefing with a printed shot list of specific animals and angles she wanted. She had done one prior safari 3 years earlier and mentioned it enough times during the briefing that the other guests had tuned her out. The lead guide ran through the safety protocols the same way he always did. Vonnie took in the parts she agreed with and dismissed the rest as overcaution. African bush elephants are the largest land animals on Earth. Adult bulls can weigh up to 13,000 pounds and charge at 25 miles per hour. A bull in musth is a different level of dangerous entirely. Musth is a hormonal state that floods the animal with testosterone and makes it aggressive, unpredictable, and extremely easy to provoke. The visible sign is a dark, oily fluid running down the side of the face. Every guide in elephant country knows what that means. The group picked up the bull at around 9:40 a.m., about 2 miles into the walk. He was standing at the edge of a dry riverbed, partially in shade, angled away from the group. The lead guide stopped everyone and assessed from about 80 yards out. The dark staining on the bull's left cheek was visible from that distance. He signaled the group to hold and began moving them laterally to route around the animal with the wind in their favor. Vonnie stepped out of the line and went forward. She had been shooting the elephant since the group stopped, and when the guide redirected everyone sideways, she decided that was not the angle she wanted. She closed the distance to around 55 yards. The rear guide moved to cut her off. She waved him away without making eye contact and kept going, dropping into a crouch to adjust her frame. The bull turned and came. The lead guide fired into the air and shouted. The bull did not slow. Vonnie got to her feet and took 2 steps back before the animal covered the remaining distance and hit her. The bull's lowered head hit her at full speed, sent her mass, and drove her straight down into the dry riverbed. He followed with a tusk thrust into her left side before the lead guide's second shot caused him to veer off. First contact to the bull, clearing the area, was about 11 seconds. The rear guide reached her within 30 seconds. She was already unresponsive. A radio call went to base camp immediately, but the logistics worked against them. Getting her to the nearest vehicle access point required a 20-minute carry on foot, and the response team was another 45 minutes out from there. It was 68 minutes before anyone with medical training got to her. The autopsy showed multiple fatal injuries. Both sides of her chest had broken ribs from the impact with the ground. The tusk had entered her left side, collapsing the lung. Her spleen had ruptured. Any one of those injuries required immediate surgery. She was over an hour from anyone who could provide it. Her camera was recovered about 12 feet from where she fell. The last image on the memory card was a shot of the bull already mid-charge, taken at under 30 yards. She never stopped shooting. The lead guide's actions were reviewed and found to be sound at every point. The bull was monitored in the weeks after, but not destroyed. The death was recorded as accidental, with departure from the group formation and deliberate provocation of a bull and must listed as contributing factors. It was March 14, 2015, at a working ostrich farm on the R328 outside Outshorn in the Western Cape. Vanessa had been married less than a year, trying to build a family that didn't quite want her yet, and she was losing an argument she didn't even know she was having. Vanessa Greer was 34, a secondary school administrator from Bristol, who had married Dale Greer 11 months earlier. The South Africa trip had been her idea, including a last-minute stop at an ostrich farm she booked after seeing a brochure at their guest house. Dale's children, Liam, 11, and Priya, 9, showed little interest, and as the trip grew tense, Vanessa kept pushing harder for everyone to enjoy it. Ostriches in the main enclosure, 7 adults, ranged between 220 and 280 pounds and stood close to 8 feet tall. They have forward-facing kicks powered by legs capable of delivering over 2,000 pounds of force per strike, with a single claw on each foot capable of causing severe and potentially fatal trauma to large animals, and that include us humans. You have to understand that they are not domesticated, they are managed. The guide, a farm employee named Joe, warned the group to stay behind the rope line and avoid approaching or feeding the ostriches through the fence. Vanessa interrupted twice to complain that the rules seemed excessive compared to the close-up photos advertised online. A German family on the tour later said Joe repeated the warning after Vanessa had already stepped past the rope once for a photo and laughed off the correction as overdramatic for birds. Dale quietly pulled her back, and from then on, Joe kept a closer watch on her. The German teenager had been filming parts of the tour on his phone, capturing what happened next. At the third paddock, Vanessa moved to the rope line while the group was clustered near Joe, who was discussing feeding behavior. One adult bird, later identified by farm staff as a female, had separated from the group near the far fence and was moving parallel to the rope line at a slow walk. Vanessa stepped over the rope. Joe immediately raised his voice and stepped forward to order her back, but she was already raising her phone and had crossed fully into the buffer zone. Witnesses said that she justified just taking a picture in an irritated tone before waving Joe off with one hand. Witnesses saw the bird stop walking. It turned its head. Its wings, each spanning close to 6 feet, shifted outward from its body in a distinct posture that farm staff later described as a standard threat display. People heard Joe shouting. The bird covered the remaining 12 feet in under 2 seconds. The first kick connected with her upper chest and left shoulder, and she went down sideways onto the clay. The second kick came as she was falling, striking her lower abdomen before she fully hit the ground. She did not get up. The bird stepped forward and kicked again into her side as she lay on the ground. Dale crossed the rope line and reached her, and the bird turned and kicked him once across the left forearm and hip before Joe drove it back using a long-handled distraction pole. Liam and Priya were still behind the rope. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later from a clinic on the main road. Vanessa was conscious but unresponsive to questions. She was airlifted to a hospital. Dale was treated on site for a fractured forearm and bruised hip and was discharged that evening. However, Vanessa died at 11:52 p.m. from blunt force internal injuries. The flight back was quiet, filled with administrative tasks, canceling the safari leg, arranging leave from work, and explaining to an 11-year-old why his stepmother wasn't coming home. Honestly, the tragedy was less the bird's violence and more the fact that even in her final moments, she was still arguing alone. It was February 27th, 2018, at the Daintree River in Queensland, Australia. In the pre-dawn light, dense rainforest canopy filtered what little visibility there was, leaving the riverbank in muted gray tones. The water moved slowly through mangroves and mudflats, where the boundary between land and river was uneven and partially obscured by roots and sediment. Norva Stelp, 49, worked in logistics administration in Brisbane. Recently divorced, she was traveling alone along the Queensland coast, documenting her trip through photography and a private blog shared with a small group. She had limited experience with wildlife environments, but was confident in her own judgment and often relied on personal interpretation when observing animals. She arrived early at a public river access point along the Daintree system before any guided tours were present. The area was marked with warning signage advising caution due to crocodile activity, especially near the waterline and mud banks where visibility was limited. The saltwater crocodile is an apex ambush predator capable of remaining almost completely still for extended periods before striking with extreme speed over short distances. In the early morning, individuals may rest near the surface or along mud banks, sometimes with minimal visible movement, which can make them appear inactive despite being fully alert. At the river's edge, Norva observed a large male crocodile lying partially on a mud bank with its body aligned toward the water. Its mouth was slightly open in a thermoregulatory posture. She stopped to take photographs and moved closer to the waterline for a lower angle shot, despite a nearby visitor, Jerome Katz, calling out warnings and advising her to move back. Jerome kept telling her to step back, saying the crocodile could hit from close range without any warning at all. But she stayed where she was, still aiming her camera, trying to get the shot from just a few meters off the water. The animal didn't move at all, just lying there, so calm that it almost felt harmless, even though something about it didn't quite sit right in the background. Without warning, the crocodile initiated a rapid ambush. It surged forward from the mud bank in a short, explosive burst, closing the distance in seconds. The attack was direct and immediate, with no prolonged display or hesitation. The first bite struck Norva's left thigh with extreme force, causing catastrophic soft tissue destruction and likely severe vascular injury. The impact caused immediate collapse, and she was pulled off balance into the mud and shallow water. The crocodile maintained its grip and dragged her fully into the river in a continuous motion. After that point, everything just shifts into the water with her. Nothing stays on land anymore. Once in the water, the animal submerged with her, disappearing beneath the surface. As is typical for saltwater crocodile behavior, the crocodile likely repositioned its prey underwater in deeper sections or near submerged structures where visibility was limited and currents were stronger. The primary injury left Norva incapacitated almost immediately due to a combination of severe trauma and blood loss. Once submerged, she was unable to surface effectively, and drowning followed as the secondary and final mechanism of death. Jerome Katz immediately called emergency services and provided a detailed report within minutes. Search and rescue teams were dispatched quickly, but response time was extended due to difficult terrain, limited river access points, and low visibility conditions on the water. River-based units arrived roughly 35 minutes later and began coordinated searches of the area. Operations were complicated by strong current flow, submerged roots, and shifting debris along the riverbed, all of which reduced underwater visibility and hindered tracking. Norva Stelp's body was recovered several days later downstream, located within a submerged root structure, consistent with entanglement and transport through the river system over time. The forensic report concluded that death resulted from a combination of traumatic injury, hemorrhagic blood loss, and drowning following incapacitation caused by the crocodile attack. Wildlife officers later captured and removed a large male saltwater crocodile from the river system as a precaution after the confirmed fatal encounter. Authorities also updated warning signs and visitor guidance, stressing the need to stay well back from the waterline, especially in low visibility conditions. Jerome Katz gave a formal statement and did not speak publicly afterward. The incident stayed limited to regional coverage with no wider national attention. Norva's travel blog remained online, but inactive, later resurfacing occasionally in discussions about river safety in northern Australia. It was May 11th, 2016, in Hohenwald, Tennessee. The morning tour at the Managed Elephant Facility was moving through its scheduled stations, small groups following guides along marked pathways. The rules were posted at every stop and repeated at the entrance. It advised visitors to stay behind the barriers and avoid unsupervised contact. Deborah Kane, 58, was a retired travel agent who had spent 30 years booking wildlife tours for other people and had decided she knew more about animals than most guides half her age. Friends described her as opinionated and confident, someone who rarely accepted correction and almost never admitted she was wrong. She had a particular interest in elephants, referencing documentaries and travel programs throughout the morning as evidence of her familiarity with the animals. From the moment the tour began, she positioned herself not as a visitor following instructions, but as someone assessing whether the instructions were worth following. This is the part that gets me. She'd spent 30 years booking these tours. She knew the rules, just didn't think they applied to her. At the first stop, she tried to feed one of the elephants outside the scheduled feeding window. The guide corrected her. Deborah told him the animal was clearly expecting food and that withholding it was unnecessary. The guide moved on, At the second stop, she reached out to touch an elephant during a no-contact segment. The guide corrected her again. She told him the rule made no sense, given how calm the animal appeared. At the third stop, she crossed a rope boundary to get a closer photograph and had to be escorted back. She responded loudly, asking why the rules existed at all if the animals were accustomed to people. At some point during the tour, she told the guide, a 26-year-old handler with 3 years of hands-on experience, that her knowledge of elephant behavior from documentaries was extensive. The guide said nothing and kept the group, 26 years old, with 3 years of hands-on experience. And she told him his documentary knowledge was not as good as hers. I genuinely had to put my notes down for a second when I read that. The final station was a controlled feeding area. Visitors stood behind a reinforced steel barrier fitted with a narrow feeding slot that limited how far a hand could extend. The elephant at this station was Rosie, a 47-year-old female who had been at the facility for 9 years. Staff described her as stable and accustomed to visitors, but highly food-motivated and sensitive to sudden contact near her face. Elephants have highly developed spatial memory and strong food-motivated behavior. An animal accustomed to a feeding routine will track and anticipate contact near its face, and react sharply to anything that disrupts that expectation. The guide explained the rules before the group approached. Stay behind the barrier. Keep hands flat. Do not reach past the designated point. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. Deborah joined the group at the barrier and followed the instructions for about 30 seconds. Then, she decided to take a photograph. The angle was not right from behind the slot. She stepped to the side of the designated feeding slot, where the barrier curvature created a slightly wider gap, and leaned past the intended limit, reaching out to touch Rosie's face to hold her still for the shot. Rosie pulled back sharply, her head swinging and her trunk moving in a rapid reactive motion. Deborah lost her balance forward, dropping at the base of the barrier with her upper body angled into the reach zone through the gap. Rosie reacted instantly, slamming her forefoot down onto Deborah's upper body and pinning her against the ground with crushing force. The compression was immediate and severe, fracturing multiple ribs and causing catastrophic internal injury to her chest cavity. The guide reacted within seconds. The area was cleared and emergency services were called. Deborah Kane was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 58 years old. Investigators discovered repeated violations led to unauthorized contact, triggering elephants' forceful reactive behavior, causing fatal injuries. The hardest part is that the guide documented everything, every correction, violation, and warning. It's all in the report, and none of it stopped what happened at the final station. It was August 9th, 2017, and the late summer sun hung low over the coastal mountains of southeastern Alaska, where a remote fly-in fishing lodge operated along a salmon river accessible only by float plane. The surrounding wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, with the nearest road over 50 miles away. The Sockeye Run was nearing its peak, drawing both sport fishermen and the grizzly bears that depended on the migration to build fat reserves before winter. The river was low enough in places to expose gravel islands where bear tracks were visible. Darlene Kosuth was a 47-year-old orthodontist from Boca Raton, Florida, with no prior bear country experience, though she had informed the lodge she was an avid hiker and considered herself comfortable around wildlife. She had booked the 5-day fishing package as a birthday trip for herself, telling friends beforehand that she planned to get close enough to photograph grizzlies feeding on salmon. Her first 2 days had been marked by repeated clashes with staff, complaints about accommodations, demands for a private guide rather than sharing with other guests, and loud criticism of meals in front of other visitors. The morning fishing session was led by a 31-year-old guide named Callum Renwick, a wildlife biology graduate who had worked Alaskan salmon rivers for 6 seasons. Renwick carried bear spray on his chest harness and, in some operations, a firearm as a last resort. He briefed the group of 4, covering mandatory protocols. Maintain tight formation. Never approach bears within 100 yards. Stay calm. Speak softly, and back away slowly during encounters, and follow his instructions without hesitation. Kosuth interrupted the briefing twice. First to ask if the rules were necessary, given that she had hiked in Yellowstone, and again to suggest Renwick was being dramatic for less experienced guests. The group reached a wide gravel bar, where the river narrowed through a shallow riffle. Approximately 200 yards upstream, a grizzly sow and 2 young cubs were fishing in the shallows. Kossuth fished for 20 minutes before losing interest. She set her rod down and walked upstream along the gravel bar, camera in hand, toward the sow. Renwick called out immediately. She waved him off without turning, saying she just wanted a couple of shots. He moved to intercept, positioning himself directly in her path and commanding her to stop. Kossuth told him to move. She insisted she had been around wildlife her entire life and did not need a babysitter. She warned that every fishing forum and travel site would hear about the lodge's service. When Renwick held his position and repeated his command, she sidestepped around him and continued walking. Grizzly bears are the most powerful terrestrial predators in North America, with adult females weighing between 300 and 450 pounds. Their claws extend up to 4 inches and can cause devastating wounds with a single swipe. Grizzly sows with cubs are responsible for the majority of fatal bear attacks, their defensive instincts overriding any tolerance of humans. A grizzly can sprint at speeds exceeding 35 miles per hour. Grizzly bears have been responsible for rare but well-documented fatal attacks across North America. Kossuth had closed to roughly 40 to 50 yards from the sow when the bear stood upright, scanning the riverbank. The sow had already begun tracking Kossuth's approach. She lowered her head and surged forward in a bluff charge, 20 yards in an explosive burst, gravel spraying, before stopping abruptly, huffing and stamping. Kossuth froze. Renwick, roughly 10 yards behind her, had his bear spray drawn and called to her to back toward him slowly, without turning. She remained frozen for several seconds, then turned sharply and began walking quickly back. The combination of close distance and sudden movement triggered the defensive charge. The sow closed the remaining distance with terrifying speed, reaching Kossuth before Renwick could close the gap. According to the incident report filed by the State Wildlife Agency, the sow knocked Kossuth to the ground and delivered multiple rapid bites and swipes, many impacting the head and neck. Renwick deployed multiple bursts of bear spray toward the bear's face. The damage had already been done by the time the spray took effect, but the sow recoiled and retreated toward her cubs, disengaging once the perceived threat stopped moving. The entire attack lasted less than 10 seconds. The injuries to Kossuth's head and neck resulted in catastrophic trauma, leading to rapid death. Renwick radioed for emergency evacuation. Due to the remote location, evacuation took over 2 hours. The investigation determined Kossuth had deliberately bypassed her guide's verbal commands and approached a grizzly sow with cubs well inside safe distance. Renwick was cleared of all responsibility. The incident was logged with the State Wildlife Agency. It was September 23, 2016. The Kedarnath Pilgrimage Trail in Uttarakhand passed through mountainous terrain at elevations approaching 12,000 feet. The narrow path, carved into cliffsides, was used regularly by pilgrims and visitors. Mae James, 38, arrived in the region 3 days earlier, carrying more camera equipment than survival gear. A freelance travel blogger from Portland, she had been struggling financially, and her online following had plateaued despite increasingly desperate attempts at viral content. She live-streamed sunrise yoga poses and pseudo-philosophical reflections, ignoring local customs and guidance. Villagers and fellow travelers grew weary of her condescending attitude and constant complaints about accommodations, insisting on special treatment as a content creator. Her presence during peak pilgrimage season marked her last attempt to salvage her failing blog. She clashed repeatedly with guides over safety protocols, dismissing warnings about weather and wildlife as superstition, while alienating other pilgrims with staged controversies and manufactured authenticity. The Kedarnath region harbors a significant population of Indian leopards, solitary predators capable of reaching 150 pounds and possessing bite forces exceeding 400 pounds per square inch. These cats are perfectly adapted mountain hunters, capable of dragging prey twice their weight up vertical cliff faces and remaining completely silent while stalking through dense rhododendron forests. Unlike their African cousins, Indian leopards have adapted to high-altitude hunting and show increased aggression during monsoon season when their natural prey becomes scarce. Village elder Ramesh had warned the evening group about a man-eating leopard that had killed a goat herder 3 weeks earlier near the trail's most dangerous section. The animal had shown unusual boldness, attacking during daylight and displaying no fear of human presence. Ramesh emphasized the critical importance of traveling in groups and avoiding the trail after sunset. Maya interrupted repeatedly, calling him a fear-mongering patriarch and accusing the village of perpetuating superstitious nonsense to maintain their patriarchal grip on spiritual tourism. When 2 young volunteers approached May at 7:15 p.m. to discourage her planned solo evening hike, she became increasingly hostile. She announced loudly to her live stream audience that she would not be mansplained or spiritually gatekeepered by backward locals who clearly did not understand her authentic journey. May declared her intention to hike alone at dusk for better lighting and genuine solitude, dismissing the volunteers' pleas as attempts to control her spiritual experience. She stormed away from the rest house at 7:30 p.m. with her phone camera rolling, determined to capture content that would finally make her travel blog profitable. May walked along the mountain path around 8:15 p.m., using her phone camera while adjusting settings for low-light conditions. Near a sharp switchback bordered by dense rhododendron bushes, a 150-pound male leopard was present in the vicinity. The leopard had been moving through the undergrowth and positioned itself on a rock outcropping approximately 8 feet above the trail. Leopards possess exceptional night vision, approximately 6 times better than humans, and their spotted coats provide perfect camouflage in dappled mountain shadows. May never stood a chance of seeing the predator watching her from above, its golden eyes tracking every movement as she fumbled with her phone's camera settings. The leopard descended from the rock and struck her from behind, knocking her forward onto the rocky trail. Its foreclaws secured her shoulders while its jaws closed at the base of her neck. Her phone fell from her hand, ending the live stream. The leopard adjusted its grip, maintaining pressure as she struggled beneath its weight. The leopard maintained its grip on her throat, applying sustained pressure consistent with large feline killing behavior. As trauma and airway compression progressed, her resistance weakened. After she became unresponsive, the animal secured her by the shoulder and dragged her off the trail into denser brush. May sustained extensive trauma to multiple areas during the attack, which contributed to significant blood loss and impaired mobility. Local searchers later located her backpack, scattered fragments of her phone, and other personal items along the path. Her body was subsequently recovered further down the ravine. The coroner's examination confirmed trauma to the neck, shoulders, and upper back consistent with predation by a large feline. Death resulted from blood loss, shock, and blunt force injuries. Local newspapers reported the incident briefly as a tourist fatality. Regional authorities increased patrols along the trail following the incident. It was July 18th, 2015. The tour ran out of a small coastal outfitter on the Gulf side of Florida, running half-day snorkel trips to a shallow reef about 2 miles offshore. The water averaged between 8 and 14 feet deep, and the fish density at the site was high enough to regularly attract larger predatory species. Brenda Ford was 43 years old. She was a fitness instructor from Tampa, Florida, and had taken this specific tour twice before. She made sure everyone on the boat knew that before they left the dock. She had strong opinions about how coastal guides handled shark sightings, specifically that pulling a group out of the water was a liability decision rather than a safety one, and she shared those opinions with the group during the pre-departure briefing without being asked. It was the kind of thing you say when you want the people around you to know you are not like them. Bull sharks are one of the most dangerous coastal shark species in the world. They are common in shallow, warm water environments, including the same reef systems used for recreational snorkeling. Adult bull sharks average between 7 and 11 feet in length and between 200 and 500 pounds. They are aggressive, highly territorial in shallow water, and are responsible for a significant number of unprovoked attacks on humans globally. A bull shark making slow investigative passes through a group of swimmers is reason enough to end the session. Whether it attacks or not is beside the point. The guide's job is not to wait and find out. The group entered the water at around 10:15 a.m. 6 guests and the guide. Conditions were good, light current, visibility around 25 feet. The first 40 minutes were uneventful. At around 10:58 a.m., the guide spotted a bull shark moving along the outer edge of the reef at about 10 feet down, heading toward the group. The animal was roughly 8 feet long and kept circling back toward the swimmers. The guide signaled an immediate water exit. 5 of the 6 guests started moving toward the boat. Brenda surfaced, looked at the boat, looked back toward the shark, and told the group out loud that the guide was overreacting. Then she went back under. The guide surfaced and called to her. She came up briefly, said the shark was nowhere near her, and that she was not cutting her session short over nothing, and went back down. The guide instructed the boat operator to reposition toward her and tracked her from the surface. She had moved away from the reef into open water in the direction the shark had last been traveling. The guide could see her from the surface, hovering at mid-depth, facing outward. The shark came from below and to her left. A single fast strike to the upper left thigh, angled upward. It hit, released, and moved off. Brenda was knocked upward and broke the surface hard. The guide reached her within seconds of her surfacing. The wound was immediately serious. The bite had opened the left thigh deeply enough to reach the major vessels. Blood loss in open water was fast. The guide applied direct pressure with both hands and called the boat in. It reached them in about 90 seconds. Getting Brenda onto the deck took another minute. The boat operator pushed the throttle toward shore while the guide held pressure on the wound. The nearest shore access was about 12 minutes away at full speed. She lost consciousness around 4 minutes into the return. Emergency services were already waiting at the dock based on the radio call made during transit. Brenda Ford was pronounced dead at the dock. The femoral artery in her left thigh had been severed. That artery carries blood at high pressure, and once it is cut, the body loses blood faster than anyone on a moving boat can stop. By the time they reached the dock, the window for any kind of intervention had already closed. The boat's radio log documented the exit signal, the emergency call, and the return time. The 5 guests who had complied with the evacuation signal all gave consistent accounts of the briefing and the events on the water. The death was recorded as accidental. The circumstances that led to it were not. It was March 3rd, 2017, and the sun had just risen over Thabakaya Wildlife Reserve in Limpopo Province of South Africa. Dry acacia scrub stretched across the landscape, the golden grass still heavy with morning stillness. A safari vehicle had paused on a raised overlook where guests were watching wildlife movement in the distance. Greta Folson, 61, had worked in Scottsdale real estate for more than 2 decades. Recently retired into part-time consulting, she had spent a year preparing for the safari, studying wildlife documentaries and reading travel material despite having no prior field experience. She often described her domestic cats as a kind of small-scale wild animal, a comparison others occasionally challenged. She was traveling with a small group of American tourists, guided by Sifo Ndlovu, a licensed reserve guide. The morning drive had begun before sunrise with clear instructions. Remain seated at all times, keep limbs inside the vehicle, and do not approach or exit under any circumstances. The surrounding terrain was open but visually deceptive, with low brush that allowed predators to move undetected at close range. The rules are simple, but the environment doesn't make them feel urgent. African lions are ambush predators that rely on concealment and short bursts of high-speed acceleration rather than sustained pursuit. Earlier in the morning, the group had observed a pride moving through a dry riverbed at a distance. Greta commented that they appeared calm and not interested in people, despite being reminded that distance and visibility can be misleading in open savanna terrain. Later, the vehicle stopped at a second viewing point along a low embankment bordered by a wooden safety fence. From this position, a sub-adult lion was visible farther out in the brush. Sifo scanned the surrounding area, as is standard procedure in open terrain stops. Greta stepped onto the vehicle's running board and then climbed over the low boundary fence onto the embankment edge despite being instructed to remain inside the vehicle. She stated she wanted a clearer photograph and believed the animal's distance made it safe. Within seconds, a lioness emerged from the grass approximately 11 meters to her left. She was already in a low stalking posture, partially concealed by vegetation. Sifo shouted for everyone to get down and remain inside the vehicle. The lioness accelerated immediately. Covering the short distance in a few seconds, she closed in a direct line toward Greta. The impact struck her at upper torso level, knocking her off the embankment and down a short slope. She landed on her back, momentarily separated from the animal. The lioness quickly recovered and attacked again, biting the back of Greta's neck and upper shoulder. The bite caused a high cervical spinal cord injury, resulting in immediate paralysis and rapid loss of consciousness, followed shortly by respiratory arrest. Inside the vehicle, things broke into chaos fast. People were shouting, some freezing up, and one passenger tried to open the door before Sifo and the tracker physically pulled them back and told them to stay put. Sifo took a controlled shot into the air using a reserve-issued rifle under emergency protocol. It wasn't aimed at the animal, just enough to break the situation and force space. The lioness backed off a short distance, but didn't leave. She stayed there, watching, like she was deciding whether to continue or not. Even when it pauses, it doesn't feel like it's gone. After that, there wasn't much anyone could safely do. Everyone was stuck in place, inside the vehicle, because stepping out or firing again risked making things worse in such close, open terrain. They had to wait for backup while keeping everyone contained. By the time reserve response teams finally arrived, there was nothing left to reverse. Greta had already died at the scene. The medical assessment later confirmed a high spinal injury that shut down breathing almost immediately, leaving no real chance for medical intervention, given how fast it happened and how far they were from proper emergency care. The official investigation concluded that the incident occurred after Greta exited the designated safety zone in violation of guide instructions. The safari operator's internal review found that standard protocols were followed by staff and that the encounter resulted from a sudden ambush by a wild predator in close-range terrain. The lioness was not euthanized, as authorities classified the behavior as natural predation response following human proximity intrusion rather than abnormal aggression. Following the incident, the reserve reinforced boundary markings at viewing stops and updated visitor briefing procedures to emphasize that even short-range exits from vehicles in open terrain can trigger immediate predatory response. Greta's family requested privacy, and the incident was recorded as a rare but recognized human-predator encounter resulting from a breakdown of safety boundaries in a wild, uncontrolled environment. It was July 14, 2014, on the eastern bank of a channel in the Okavango Delta, Botswana, where a woman who had spent 3 years photographing animals she loved put herself in danger because she refused to believe one of them could hurt her. Maricel Kovac was 38, a secondary school science teacher from Ljubljana who had taken wildlife photography seriously, but never enough for a proper living. She was in the middle of a divorce from a man who ran guided hunts in the Slovenian highlands and had, by multiple accounts from mutual friends, spent their final 2 years together, telling her that her sentimentality about animals was embarrassing, and she fought back by cheating with one of his best friends. I mean, someone who hunts animals versus someone who appreciates them. There's a place for each of them, but definitely not in a marriage. The Botswana trip was self-funded on a tight budget, a solo slot booked into a small group safari running out of Maun. She carried a mid-range DSLR and a 400mm lens she had saved 11 months to buy. Her goal for the trip was a usable frame of a hippo surfacing at close range, something she had told another tourist on the first morning she had wanted for years. Hippopotamus are not aquatic animals in any meaningful behavioral sense. They graze on land at night and use water purely as a thermal refuge and territorial base during the day. A large adult bull can reach 7,700 pounds and move through shallow water at close to 19 miles per hour in a short charge. If you're a fan of the channel, you know they are responsible for more human fatalities annually in Africa than any other large land animal. The tour guide, a man named Deo, who had run Delta routes for 9 years, had identified a disturbance pattern in the water approximately 82 feet upstream before the group disembarked. He directed everyone to the raised viewing platform and told them explicitly not to approach the bank edge. He pointed at the surface disturbance and identified it as a submerged pod, at minimum 2 animals. Maricel then told him he was reading it wrong, that the movement was current related, and that his caution was, in her words, the same reflexive overprotection she got from people who had never actually studied these animals. 2 other tourists on the platform heard this exchange, with additional berating from Maricel that they described as demeaning the man's job. One of them later confirmed that Deo repeated the warning a second time and physically stepped in front of her as she moved toward the descent, but she shoved him multiple times and stepped around him. She removed her sandals at the platform edge and walked into the shallows until the water was just below her knees. The ripple pattern she had been photographing was approximately 59 feet out and moving slowly, though small surface ripples and intermittent snorting breaks in the water had been visible closer to the bank moments earlier, according to the other tourists. Deo was shouting hysterically from the platform, and I don't blame him. He was about to watch another entitled tourist become a statistic under his watch. The bull surfaced with a sudden forward surge, 4 feet from her position. It did not breach dramatically. It rose, which is worse, because there was almost no warning displacement before the mass of it was simply there. Maricel took one step backward. The animal opened its mouth and drove into her at water level. She went under in under 3 seconds of contact. The surface churned for roughly 40 seconds. Deo fired a handheld flare from the platform as a deterrent, though it had no behavioral effect at that range. The group retreated from the platform edge in disarray, while Deo continued signaling on the satellite radio. In the chaos, a 61-year-old Dutch tourist named Wim Berency tripped on the platform railing during the retreat, struck his head on the corner bracket, and sustained a fatal traumatic head injury, and was later pronounced dead at the ranger station after evacuation. As for Maricel, recovery teams worked the channel for 2 days for her. Partial remains were recovered on the second day. Crocodile activity and water turbidity made full recovery impossible. Her death was ultimately ruled accidental, but I think it's suicidal. She died because she needed to be right in front of a man she decided was beneath her, and the hippo didn't care about her divorce, or her photography, or her grievances. We call it a Karen death. The entitlement, the shoving, the refusal to hear no, but really, it was just a very stupid way to prove a point that only she was still keeping score on. It was November 12th, 2013, and the afternoon sun filtered through the dense tropical canopy along a slow-moving river in the interior of Palawan, Philippines, where a small eco-lodge operated along a stretch of waterway known for its biodiversity and rich mangrove systems. The river's upper reaches were home to saltwater crocodiles that had rebounded following years of habitat protection, including a dominant male estimated at over 16 feet that local fishermen had tracked for years. The lodge had been built with full awareness of the crocodile population and maintained strict safety protocols accordingly. Catriona Delvaux was a 44-year-old Belgian freelance photographer based in Singapore, who had arrived 2 days earlier as part of a Southeast Asian travel circuit. Delvaux had built a modest portfolio of wildlife and landscape photography and had a reputation among travel industry contacts for being exceptionally difficult with service staff. She had already filed a complaint with the lodge manager on her first morning, accusing staff of failing to clean her cabin adequately and demanding a partial refund for the inconvenience. The lodge's riverside area was divided into zones. An upstream swimming area was enclosed by steel mesh barriers and monitored by staff. The downstream section, nearest the crocodile habitat, was marked by warning signs in English, Filipino, and Mandarin. A rope barrier with attached placards blocked access to stone steps leading to the water's edge. Beyond the rope, a locked steel gate separated the grounds from the restricted riverbank. Delvaux had expressed irritation about the swimming restrictions on her first day. On the afternoon of the incident, she demanded staff open the locked gate so she could photograph the river from the lower steps. The attendant explained the area was permanently restricted due to a confirmed large crocodile. Delvaux dismissed this, calling the signs a liability precaution. She told the attendant it would only take a few minutes. She asked to speak to the manager. The manager repeated the restriction, explaining the dominant male had been sighted within 48 hours. Delvaux told him she had traveled extensively through Southeast Asia, had never encountered a crocodile, and that his refusal would result in a detailed review campaign across every major platform, naming the lodge and individual staff. The manager did not relent. During the quiet mid-afternoon, when staff presence along the riverside was minimal, Delvaux left her cabin with her camera. She stepped over the rope barrier, climbed around the locked gate using the adjacent fence railing, and descended the stone steps to the restricted riverbank. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles on Earth, with dominant males regularly exceeding 16 feet and weighing over 1,500 pounds. They possess the most powerful bite of any living animal, generating pressures exceeding 3,700 pounds per square inch, among the strongest bites ever recorded. Their ambush strategy relies on remaining motionless and invisible in murky water before striking with explosive speed. The attack involves clamping onto a victim and immediately dragging toward deeper water. Saltwater crocodiles are responsible for documented fatal attacks annually across their range in Southeast Asia and northern Australia. Delvaux crouched on the lowest step to photograph the river surface, her lower legs close to the waterline. The crocodile had been resting in the murky shallows within roughly 10 to 15 feet of the steps, completely concealed beneath the opaque surface. There was little visible disturbance beyond a sudden surge at the waterline, The crocodile lunged explosively from the water's edge, massive jaws clamping around Delvo's lower body. The strike was instantaneous, the animal's momentum pulling her from the steps and into the river. A brief splash and a cut-short sound were the only indication anything had occurred before the crocodile dragged her beneath the surface and away from the bank. The murky water settled back to stillness within seconds. Staff discovered the breached barriers approximately 45 minutes later. Emergency services and wildlife rangers were contacted. Partial remains were recovered downstream over the following days, consistent with crocodile feeding behavior. The dominant male was later captured and removed by wildlife authorities. The investigation confirmed Delvo had bypassed 3 layers of barriers, signage, rope, and locked gate against explicit staff refusal. The lodge was cleared of all liability. The incident was reported to the Regional Environmental Authority. It was August 15, 2014, and the ancient ice of a glacier stretched across Alaska's temperate wilderness like a frozen river of time, constantly calving into the lake below. The retreating ice had exposed rocky moraine and emerging vegetation, creating prime foraging habitat for brown bear preparing for winter. Celeste Moorhead, 44, arrived at the glacier viewing area that morning as part of a desperate attempt to repair her fractured relationship with her 19-year-old daughter Emma during an Alaskan cruise excursion. A real estate agent from Phoenix, she had spent years watching her only child drift away, their relationship strained by boundary violations and attention-seeking behaviors. Colleagues knew her as domineering, successful professionally, but personally toxic. The trip represented Celeste's last attempt to prove she could change, though arguments over control of the itinerary had already begun. Her daughter had reluctantly agreed after months of guilt-laden calls, but their tentative reconciliation was fraying under Celeste's need to document every moment for social media validation. The glacier viewing area sat surrounded by dense rainforest, where spruce and hemlock trees provided cover for Southeast Alaska's brown bear population. Alaskan brown bears can exceed 1,500 pounds during peak season, with females averaging around 500 pounds. They can accelerate from standing to high speeds within seconds when defending cubs. Their massive claws and powerful jaws evolve to catch salmon and eliminate threats to their offspring. Park naturalist Jacinth Marinin had begun her standard wildlife safety briefing by informing the 20-person tour group about a female brown bear with 2 yearling cubs spotted that morning near the glacier viewpoint, approximately 400 meters from the visitor center. She emphasized the critical importance of maintaining at least 100 yards distance from all bears, explaining how sows with cubs represented the most dangerous encounter scenario due to their hypersensitive protective instincts. Celeste interrupted Jacinth's safety presentation multiple times, loudly dismissing the warnings as overblown liability protection designed to limit tourist experiences. When the group spotted the sow and her cubs through binoculars at approximately 150 meters distance, Celeste pushed to the front and announced her intention to capture real photographs rather than tourist snapshots. Both Jacinth and Emma pleaded with her to respect the safety guidelines, but Celeste exploded in fury, screaming that she was paying good money for this experience and would not be controlled by government bureaucrats who clearly did not understand her needs as a paying customer. Despite increasingly desperate pleas from Emma and direct orders from Jacinth to remain on the marked trail, Celeste stormed away from the group toward the foraging bears. Emma's tears and Jacinth's radio calls to park headquarters went ignored as Celeste marched across the rocky terrain with her digital camera extended. Celeste approached the sow foraging while her cubs played nearby on the glacier-polished rocks. The massive bear immediately detected the threat, rising onto her hind legs and huffing a clear warning to retreat. Celeste continued forward with her camera raised, either failing to recognize or deliberately ignoring the unmistakable signs of an agitated mother defending her young. A brown bear sow protecting cubs doesn't just attack, she eliminates threats with extreme prejudice. Her attacks are designed not to wound, but to neutralize completely, often continuing long after the threat has stopped moving. Celeste had just triggered every maternal instinct evolution had hardened into this 500-pound killing machine. The bear responded defensively, advancing toward Celeste and making physical contact. She fell onto the rocky terrain and sustained multiple injuries to the head, neck, shoulders, and upper torso, including puncture wounds and lacerations from the bear's teeth and claws. During the encounter, the bear maintained contact for several minutes, while attempting to neutralize the perceived threat to her cubs. Celeste's movements toward safety were hindered by the injuries sustained, which included deep tissue trauma consistent with defensive behavior by a large mammal protecting offspring. Celeste became unresponsive as blood loss, shock, and blunt force trauma affected her condition. After perceiving that the immediate threat to her cubs had ended, the bear retreated with the cubs toward the surrounding tree line. Tour guides immediately radioed local emergency services. First responders arrived by helicopter, but Celeste had already died due to the severity of the injuries and hemorrhage. The coroner's examination confirmed extensive puncture wounds and lacerations to the head, neck, shoulders, and upper torso, consistent with a defensive attack by a brown bear. Death was determined to be caused by traumatic injuries, blood loss, and shock. Regional wildlife authorities concluded that the attack was a defensive response, triggered by human proximity and violation of established safety protocols. The bear family was monitored but not relocated, as their behavior was consistent with natural maternal defense. It was June 22, 2017, in Bastrop, Texas. The exotic animal facility off Highway 71 operated under a state license with oversight, offering limited handler-supervised interaction sessions with large cats. The midday session had been booked privately. Linda Carver, 54, was a real estate broker from Austin. 6 months earlier, her younger sister had posted a photograph on social media of herself posing with a tiger at a facility in Florida. It was something she brought up repeatedly at family gatherings. Linda and her sister had a long history of quiet one-upmanship, and Linda did not take losing gracefully. She looked up facilities in Texas the week after the family Christmas dinner, where her sister had mentioned the tiger photo for the 3rd time, found this one, and booked the session. She was not particularly interested in tigers. She wanted a better photograph than her sister had. She arrived with her own camera, a specific idea of the shot she wanted, and very little interest in being told what she could not do. The handler met her at the enclosure and delivered the instructions before opening the access point. No sustained eye contact with the animal. Do not turn your back. Do not touch the face or head. Contact is permitted on the shoulder and flank only through the designated gap. Linda listened and then said quietly that she was paying $400 for the session and asked if that was really all she was going to be allowed to do. The handler said yes. Linda nodded and said fine, and this is where it starts, because that nod meant nothing. She had already decided. The tiger was a 9-year-old male Siberian named Atlas, who had been at the facility since he was 18 months old. He had no known prior incidents during controlled sessions. He was calm when Linda entered the interaction zone, but immediately attentive, tracking her movements from the moment she approached the barrier. Linda spent the first 2 minutes following the instructions. Then, she shifted position to improve her camera angle. The handler redirected her. She moved back, then said the angle from the designated position was not going to give her what she needed, and that she was just trying to get a decent photograph. The handler told her to stay within the contact zone. She said, okay, and shifted again almost immediately. The handler redirected her a second time. Linda said he was making this really difficult, and that she had seen people do more than this online. What gets me about that line is she said it out loud, to the handler, while standing in front of a 9-year-old Siberian tiger. Atlas turned his head away, breaking the frame Linda had been trying to set up. A tiger's muzzle, whisker bed, and jawline are among the most neurologically sensitive areas on the animal. Direct, uninvited contact there does not register as affection. It registers as threat. Even captivity-raised tigers retain that response fully intact. Instead of moving away, Linda stepped closer to the barrier. The contact gap was a narrow, reinforced opening, designed to allow limited tactile interaction with the shoulder and flank only, and was not intended for full arm extension. Linda rotated her shoulder to angle her forearm deeper through the narrow gap, pushing past the shoulder access zone toward the front of the enclosure. A subsequent facility inspection noted that the barrier gap at that station was wider than the regulated maximum, a maintenance oversight that had not been flagged in the last compliance review. The handler was offset laterally to maintain a clear control line and could not physically reach her arm before it crossed the contact threshold. She reached further toward Atlas's muzzle. The handler told her sharply to pull back. Atlas responded instantly. Direct contact on the facial area triggered an immediate bite response. The jaws closed on her extended arm at the barrier opening, the force pulling her violently into the barrier structure and causing additional traumatic injury beyond the initial bite. A Siberian tiger of that size delivers a bite capable of crushing bone and severing major vessels in a single movement. She sustained catastrophic vascular injury with associated traumatic damage to the upper torso within seconds of contact. The handler initiated emergency procedures immediately. Emergency responders arrived within 15 minutes. Linda Carver was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 54 years old. The cause of death was recorded as catastrophic vascular injury with associated traumatic damage to the upper torso, consistent with a large felid bite and drag. The facility's license was suspended pending investigation. And the part that stays with me about Linda Carver is that her sister never even knew this was about her. Ironic. It was October 11th, 2014, on a remote trail in Peru's Manu Biosphere Reserve, where dense rainforest pressed against a narrow footpath under heavy humidity after recent rains. The ground was slick with decomposing leaves, and visibility was limited by thick understory and fallen vegetation. 51-year-old Denise Harrow from Eugene, Oregon, was on a small guided eco-tour during a solo trip through South America. She worked as a private pet groomer and had developed a strong interest in reptiles through documentaries and online communities. Friends described her as confident in her interpretations of animal behavior and skeptical of warnings she considered overly cautious, often insisting snakes were misunderstood and that calm behavior reduced risk. The group was led by Mateo Vargas, a local naturalist with over a decade of experience in the Manu region. Before entering the trail, he gave standard safety instructions, emphasizing staying on the path, keeping distance from wildlife, and never interacting with snakes or other potentially dangerous animals. It all sounded like standard safety talk, the kind you hear at the start of trips like this. The fer-de-lance pit viper, Bothrops atrox, is a very venomous snake found in the Amazon. It hides well and often stays completely still, making it hard to notice. If something gets too close, it can strike very fast from a coiled position. Its venom damages blood, destroys tissue, and can lead to severe internal bleeding and organ failure. It usually doesn't warn before attacking and may stay still until it feels threatened. Midway through the hike, Mateo stopped the group after spotting a fer-de-lance coiled just off the trail, almost hidden in the wet leaf litter. He warned everyone to stay on the path, keep their distance, and move on without stopping. The group complied, but Denise lingered, watching the snake. She said it looked calm and argued that snakes only bite when provoked. Mateo repeated more firmly that it was highly venomous and that its stillness was not a sign of safety. Denise crouched near the edge of the trail while the rest of the group moved ahead. Witnesses later said she appeared focused on observing the animal and spoke as though reassuring it rather than herself. She again stated that the snake seemed relaxed because it was not moving. Mateo stepped closer and told her firmly to move back. Denise still reached one hand, slightly off the trail, palm down, trying to show what she thought was calm, non-threatening behavior. The fer-de-lance stayed still for a few seconds, coiled up with its head facing her. Then it struck. It bit the side of her right hand between the thumb and index finger in a split second. Denise jerked back onto the trail, more in shock at first than pain. Within moments, blood started coming from the puncture wounds. Mateo pulled her fully onto the path and applied pressure immobilization, while another guide radioed for emergency evacuation support. Denise remained conscious at first, but quickly began reporting intense burning pain and rapidly increasing swelling in her hand and forearm. Within minutes, the swelling extended past the wrist, and her fingers became stiff and discolored. As the group moved toward the nearest extraction point, her condition worsened. She developed dizziness, nausea, and weakness consistent with systemic envenomation. Small areas of spontaneous bleeding appeared at the gums, indicating early disruption of normal clotting function caused by the venom. By the time they reached a clearing for evacuation coordination, she required assistance to walk. Her blood pressure had dropped significantly, and she showed signs of shock, including pale skin, confusion, and increasing difficulty remaining alert. She repeatedly insisted that the snake had not meant to hurt her. She sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Field responders arrived by boat several hours later and began stabilizing her for transport, but her condition continued to worsen. She lost consciousness during evacuation and went into cardiovascular collapse before reaching anti-venom care. The medical report listed death as systemic envenomation by Bothrops atrox, causing hemorrhagic shock and organ failure from severe tissue damage and blood clotting failure. Delayed access to treatment due to the remote location was a key factor. Investigators determined that the guide had followed appropriate safety procedures, including repeated verbal warnings and immediate emergency response after the incident. Following the event, the tour operator reinforced strict wildlife distance policies and updated briefing protocols, emphasizing that no wild snake should be approached or handled under any circumstances. The incident was reported locally in Peru and briefly mentioned in online herpetology discussions. Denise's family requested privacy, and no public statements were issued afterward. It was March 14, 2016. The bush camp sat at the edge of a private game reserve in southern Africa, a loose collection of open-air structures built low into the scrubland, with no fences and no walls between the guests and the bush. Renelle Couch was 44 years old. She was an office manager from Phoenix, Arizona, and she had been saving for this trip for almost 2 years. It was a 7-day, fully guided small group safari, the kind of program where you are out in the open with the animals and nothing separating you from them. It sounds incredible, and for most people, it is. Renelle's issue was pretty simple. She thought she knew better than everyone around her, always. By day 2, she'd already complained about the meal schedule before the first full day was even over. She told staff the wake-up times were unreasonable. She got into a direct argument with one of the junior guides about the after-dark perimeter rule, framing it as a matter of common sense rather than safety, like the rule was an insult to her intelligence rather than a condition she had agreed to in writing. A leopard had been using the area around camp as part of his range for about 3 years. Wild, adult male, completely unmanaged, he moved through the perimeter at night and treated the camp like just another part of his territory. He had grown used to humans through exposure alone, not because anyone had worked with him or tamed him. That is a very different thing from safe. Staff were clear about that distinction. So was the paperwork every guest signed before arrival. On the afternoon of March 14th, the male was spotted resting near a storage structure on the eastern side of camp. 2 staff members went out to assess. Totally routine. They kept their distance, around 50 feet out, and observed him from a position downwind. He raised his head, looked in their direction, and settled back down. They watched him for a few minutes and returned to the main area. Renelle watched the whole thing from the common area, and that was enough for her. At dinner, she was telling other guests the staff were being overdramatic, that the leopard was clearly chill around people, that she'd watched the staff get close and nothing happened. One of the other guests pushed back. She brushed it off, said she trusted her own eyes. Every night, without fail, guests were reminded to stay inside the main lodge after 8 p.m. The perimeter path was off limits after dark. Every guest signed off on this before they even booked. At 9:20 p.m., Renelle left her room. She had clocked the Eastern Staff access gate earlier that day. Simple latch, not locked. With everyone else inside, she walked straight to it, lifted the bar, and stepped out into the dark with her camera and a keychain flashlight. Camp lighting carried maybe 15 feet past the perimeter. After that, it was just bush. The leopard had moved from the storage structure into low scrub about 30 feet northeast of the gate, sometime after dark. Renelle made it roughly 18 feet before he was on her. He came from behind, out of the scrub, covering the distance in under 2 seconds. The bite landed on the back of her neck and drove her straight down into the dirt. She never made a sound. Nobody knew she was missing until 10:45 p.m. when a routine interior check came up empty. Staff swept the perimeter and found the eastern gate unlatched and slightly open. They found her at 10:58 p.m., 18 feet out. The leopard was gone. Her keychain flashlight was still on in the dirt a few feet from her body. A response team reached the camp around 1:15 a.m. There was nothing to be done by then. Whatever she thought she was going to see out there, it was not worth this. Nobody wins an argument with a leopard in the dark. The post-mortem found a single bite to the back of the neck. It severed her spinal cord, and she would have been unconscious within seconds. It was over in under 3 minutes. The gate showed no signs of being forced. She opened it herself. The leopard was monitored in the weeks after, but never destroyed. The case was ruled accidental death. A wild animal responding to a stranger entering his space after dark. No staff member was found at fault. It was August 14th, 2014, on the Victoria Nile inside Murchison Falls National Park, Uganda, where the river flattens into wide channels between shifting sandbar shelves, and the afternoon had gone quiet, in the way the guides knew better than the tourists ever would. Elise Hartman was 36, a freelance regulatory consultant from Hamburg who had built a professional identity around identifying institutional failures. She traveled frequently, documented everything, and had a reputation among colleagues for pushing back against authority when she believed protocol was being applied arbitrarily. She had booked a 5-day safari through a licensed Kampala-based operator, the Nile stretch being the second day. Her stated goal, mentioned to at least 2 other passengers the night before at the lodge, was specifically to witness the crocodile behavior in the wild, not in a sanctuary. The Nile crocodile, adults regularly reaching up to 16 feet and exceeding 2,000 pounds in large dominant specimens, does not chase. It holds still in shallow water near exposed shoreline, often fully submerged except for the eyes, and waits for something to enter the strike zone. And of course, you already know their signature death roll. That August was peak nesting season, and females had been confirmed within 200 meters of the primary boat channel for 2 consecutive weeks prior. The guide had received a radio advisory that morning warning all river operators to avoid unscheduled passenger disembarkation along the central sandbar corridor due to confirmed nesting activity. He relayed this to the group at departure. At approximately 2:20 p.m., Elise began complaining of nausea and cramps, demanding the boat stop so she could stand on solid ground. The guide declined, citing the advisory directly, and maintained a strict no disembarkation safety posture in line with park protocol. She escalated. She accused the guide of fabricating the restriction to cut the excursion short. The argument lasted approximately 9 minutes. At 2:31 p.m., Elise stepped off the bow onto the sandbar unassisted while the guide was repositioning and a second crew member was at the rear engine. She landed in approximately 4 inches of water at the bar's edge. She had been standing there no more than a few seconds, roughly 6 to 8 seconds by witness estimation. The crocodile came from her left, out of water that appeared no deeper than her ankles. There was no warning sound. Witnesses described the initial movement as a white spray and a single heavy impact. The animal's jaws closed across her left thigh and lower hip. The force of the strike knocked her sideways and partially into the deeper channel adjacent to the bar. For approximately a brief moment lasting only a few seconds, she remained visible above the waterline, upper body twisted, one arm extended toward the surface. Then the crocodile rolled. A death roll in shallow water generates enough rotational force to cause catastrophic injury. This time, she went under. The guide immediately throttled the engine, shouted warnings, and radioed river patrol while maneuvering the vessel away from the sandbar edge. The animal did not resurface in that location. The river absorbed visibility rapidly, with strong current and sediment disturbance reducing surface clarity within seconds of the initial strike. A patrol vessel and wildlife unit arrived on site at approximately 30 minutes after contact. Full remains were not recovered. Death ruled accidental, with notation of victim-initiated departure from vessel against direct operator instruction during an active wildlife advisory. Authorities updated river access enforcement protocols within 60 days. No public statement was issued. It was February 5th, 2018. And the morning heat was building across the dry zone of southeastern Sri Lanka, where dense jungle bordered farmland near one of the island's largest national parks. Human-elephant conflict had intensified as expanding agriculture pushed into traditional elephant corridors, leaving solitary males increasingly aggressive. Shalane Probert was a 50-year-old marketing executive from Adelaide, Australia, on a solo trip combining beach resorts with a wildlife circuit through the island's interior. Probert maintained an active social media presence tied to her personal brand and had planned the Sri Lanka leg specifically around capturing close-contact wildlife content that would set her apart from other travel accounts in her network. She had visited an elephant sanctuary near Kandy earlier in the trip, hand-feeding habituated animals and posing alongside them for photographs, and referenced the experience repeatedly as proof of her comfort around elephants. Probert was driving a rented SUV along a narrow road 3 miles from the national park boundary when she encountered a large, solitary male elephant standing in the road. The animal was over 9 feet at the shoulder and visibly agitated. He had been involved in crop raiding incidents over previous weeks, and local villagers knew him as a problem animal. A tuk-tuk driver named Chandamal Weerakun, 34, pulled alongside and gestured urgently for her to reverse. 2 villagers shouted and waved from the roadside. Weerakun approached her window and told her firmly the elephant was dangerous and she needed to reverse immediately. Probert spoke slowly and deliberately, telling Weerakun she understood elephants. The ones at the sanctuary had been perfectly gentle. She dismissed him with a wave and said she just needed 1 photograph. She exited the vehicle, phone raised, and walked toward the elephant. Asian elephants are among the most powerful animals on Earth, with solitary adult males weighing between 8,000 and 11,000 pounds. Males involved in ongoing human-wildlife conflict are particularly dangerous. Their stress responses heightened by repeated confrontations with farmers. A charging elephant can reach up to about 25 miles per hour in short bursts, with enough mass to crush a vehicle. Elephants kill dozens of people annually in Sri Lanka, the majority in conflict zones near park boundaries. The elephant's ears spread wide, its head shook side to side. A mock charge. 3 thundering steps forward, trunk raised, then a stop. Probert stumbled but did not retreat to her vehicle. She raised her phone again. The second charge was real. No pause, no bluff. The elephant closed the distance with terrifying acceleration. According to local police and wildlife officials who reconstructed the scene from witness testimony, the trunk knocked Probert off her feet and onto the road. The elephant pressed its weight downward with its front feet and delivered a rapid series of crushing blows to her torso and lower body. The attack lasted seconds before the elephant stepped back and moved off into the jungle. Weerakoon and the villagers waited until the elephant disappeared before approaching. Emergency services were called, but the nearest hospital was over an hour away. Shalane Probert was pronounced dead upon arrival. The investigation confirmed she had approached a visibly agitated, solitary male against urgent warnings from multiple witnesses. No action was taken against the animal. The incident was reported to the National Wildlife Authority. Weerakoon and the witnesses were commended for their attempts to warn her. It was September 19, 2017, in Limpopo Province, South Africa. The bush stretched flat and dry in every direction, thorn trees casting thin shadows across red earth, the morning air still carrying the last of the night's cool before the heat came in properly. Carol Weston, 57, had waited 20 years for this trip. Her ex-husband had never wanted to go, and she had shelved it the way people shelve things. They stopped believing they will ever actually do. The divorce had changed that calculation. She had booked the safari 4 months after the papers were signed, posted about it extensively on social media, and arrived at the reserve 3 days earlier with new camera equipment. She had owned for 3 weeks, and a confidence built on 2 YouTube documentaries and 1 previous visit to a Florida wildlife park. The night before her flight, she had posted a caption that read, "Finally doing it for me." 34 people had liked it by the time she landed in Johannesburg. She had found things to criticize from the moment the vehicle left the gate. The seat she had been assigned was too far from the viewing side. The vehicle moved too slowly at the first sighting. The guide kept too much distance from the animals. She told the couple seated beside her that the operation felt amateur compared to what she had read about Kenyan safaris. She had never been to Kenya, and this is the part that gets me every time. She had never been to Kenya. She was comparing a real safari to one she had read about on the internet. The guide was Dumi, with 9 years of experience at the reserve. He answered her complaints without reacting to her tone and kept the vehicle moving on. Schedule. I respect guides like Dumi. After 9 years in the bush, he still managed someone like Carol without losing his composure. That is genuinely hard to do. The Pride was sighted at approximately 35 meters. 7 lions in total, 4 females, 2 subadults, and 1 dominant male. Large, mature, and documented in prior reserve reports as responsive to elevated movement above vehicle level. A dominant male lion's primary behavioral role within a pride is boundary enforcement. Any movement perceived as intrusion registers as a threat. Dumi positioned the vehicle at a controlled viewing distance and told all passengers clearly to remain seated and keep their movements low. Exiting the vehicle at any point during a game drive was prohibited. It had been explained before the drive began. Carol stood up immediately. She said she could not get a clear shot from a seated position and that she was almost done. Dumi told her to sit. She kept shooting. He told her again, more, firmly. She told him she had paid for the experience and turned back toward the lions. Her upper body was fully above the vehicle profile, her movement clearly visible against the open scrub behind her. What gets me is that Dumi told her twice before she even climbed down. Twice. And she told him she had paid for the experience, as if the lion was going to honor her booking. The dominant male's head turned toward the vehicle, his ears angled back, his body weight shifted forward onto his front leg. Dumi read the posture immediately and told everyone to stay down and not move. Carol looked at the lion, looked at her camera screen, and decided the angle still was not right. She climbed down from the vehicle and stepped onto the ground, despite the standing rule, one that had been explained before the drive even began. Dumi's voice changed. Get back in the vehicle, now. She held up one hand toward him and raised her camera. The lion was already moving. The charge covered the distance, with no pause and no warning sound. Carol had no time to turn back toward the vehicle. The lion hit her at full speed, and drove her to the ground with his full weight behind the impact. He pinned her and bit down on her neck and upper body, the force of the bite crushing through tissue and bone. The attack lasted only seconds. Doomy activated the emergency beacon and kept the other passengers down inside the vehicle. Response teams used deterrent fire to push the lion back before anyone could approach on foot. Carol Weston was confirmed dead at the scene. Investigators discovered the victim exited the vehicle, triggering immediate predatory lion attack after ignoring guide instructions. She was buried privately with her ex-husband in attendance. Her last social media post had received 34, but she never got to see them. It was March 14, 2015, and a wide African river flowed through a remote region inhabited by one of the continent's most dangerous mammals. The river appeared calm on the surface, but local hippos maintained territorial zones that had caused previous human fatalities. Vera Caldwell, 42, arrived in the region 6 days earlier, determined to prove herself after a bitter divorce and an inheritance that left her financially secure. Known at her school for constant dissatisfaction, she approached the 8-day eco-tour as a personal declaration of independence. Her fellow travelers quickly grew weary of her non-stop complaints about accommodations, meals, and prices. She spent days antagonizing veteran river guide Jonas Mwanza, dismissing his safety warnings as fear-mongering, all while documenting grievances for scathing online reviews. This river system harbors one of Africa's densest hippopotamus populations, with pods of 10 to 30 individuals claiming territorial stretches of shallow water where they spend daylight hours submerged to protect their sensitive skin. Adult bulls can exceed 4,000 pounds and achieve surprising speed both in water and on land. Their massive jaws evolved to crush riverbank vegetation and unfortunate intruders with equal efficiency. These deceptively docile-looking animals kill more humans annually than lions, leopards, and crocodiles combined. Their unpredictable aggression triggered by perceived threats to their territory or young. Jonas had begun the morning safety briefing by pointing to a pod of hippos visible 100 meters upstream, their ears and eyes barely breaking the surface as they monitored the approaching canoes. He explained their territorial nature and the critical importance of maintaining distance, but Vera interrupted repeatedly, accusing him of ruining the experience with unnecessary paranoia. When Jonas explained that hippos were capable of biting through wooden canoes, Vera laughed dismissively and stated she had not paid premium prices to avoid wildlife encounters. Her canoe partner, a soft-spoken retiree named Margaret, pleaded quietly for caution as they launched into the current. As the group of 6 canoes approached the hippopod, Jonas signaled for everyone to paddle toward the opposite bank, but Vera demanded Margaret steer directly toward the animals. She stood unsteadily in the narrow canoe, phone extended for video footage, shouting at the other tourists to stop being babies and get closer for dramatic shots. Jonas's repeated warnings were ignored as Vera directed Margaret to paddle closer, bringing the canoe to within approximately 15 meters of the hippopod. What Vera didn't understand was that hippos can hold their breath underwater for up to 5 minutes, allowing them to approach threats completely submerged and invisible. The bull monitoring their canoe had already begun his approach beneath the murky surface, tracking their movements through vibrations and sound. The incident began when Vera stood in the canoe, causing it to become unstable. The sudden shift disrupted the vessel's balance, and both occupants were thrown into the river. The bull hippopotamus erupted from below, its massive jaws clamping down on Vera's torso, inflicting severe injuries to the upper body, including punctures and contusions consistent with blunt force trauma. She was quickly submerged, and her phone was lost during the incident. Following the initial bite, the bull resurfaced and lunged again in short, forceful bursts. Witnesses observed repeated surges in the same area, each resulting in additional impact and forced submersion. The pattern was consistent with territorial, defensive behavior. Margaret remained on the overturned canoe and called for help while maintaining distance. Vera's body resurfaced intermittently in the turbulent water. Observers noted limited movement following the initial impact, consistent with severe trauma and water inhalation. After several forceful surges, the bull disengaged and moved toward deeper water. Vera was left unresponsive in the river. The tour guide quickly directed the remaining canoes to safety and radioed base camp. Local fishermen arrived approximately 12 minutes later, followed by park rangers 18 minutes later. Rescue personnel took approximately 45 minutes to locate Vera's body, found wedged against fallen tree branches roughly 200 meters from the attack site. The coroner's examination revealed massive internal trauma, including multiple rib fractures, punctured lungs, and severe tissue damage to the torso and abdomen. Death occurred from from drowning combined with traumatic injury. Vera's death received minimal coverage in Zambian newspapers. Her family struggled with bureaucratic delays in repatriating the body, while the tour company quietly settled with Margaret for her injuries and psychological trauma. It was August 29, 2013. The guided trek operated out of a small outfitter near the eastern edge of a wilderness area in northwestern Montana. The route covered about 9 miles of backcountry terrain over 2 days, with an overnight camp roughly halfway through. Harriet Good was 55 years old. She was a semi-retired attorney from Billings, Montana, and she led with that fact like it meant something out here. She had hiked recreationally her whole adult life and had never once had a bear encounter, which she treated as proof of competence rather than luck. During the briefing, she asked questions that were really just her own opinions, framed as curiosity. By the time the group set out, she had already decided the guide knew less about this trail than she did. Decades of hiking, without incident, had convinced her that her judgment was sound. The problem was, she had never been tested. Grizzly bears are among the most dangerous large mammals in North America. Adult females average between 290 and 400 pounds, and adult males can reach up to 790 pounds. They can outrun any human on any terrain. A grizzly defending a food cache does not bluff. It attacks immediately, and it does not stop. The group set out at 7:30 a.m. The first 4 miles were uneventful. At around 10:45 a.m., the trail passed through a dense stand of lodgepole pine and alder with visibility down to about 15 feet on either side. About a quarter mile before this section, the guide picked up a strong carrion smell. He stopped the group. A large carcass in dense cover that close to the trail meant one thing. He told everyone to tighten up, get their bear spray out, and keep moving without stopping. Harriet said it was probably a deer that died naturally, and that he was reading too much into it. He told her that was possible, and that the protocol stood regardless. She complied, barely. About 200 yards in the trail, curved sharply around a large rock outcrop. The guide came around first and stopped. A partially consumed elk carcass sat about 30 feet off the left side of the trail, freshly covered in pine duff and broken branches. He signaled the group to halt and started moving everyone backward. 4 of the 5 guests went immediately. Harriet had come around the curve and seen the carcass. She stopped but did not go back. The guide stepped in front of her and told her to move. She said she wanted to see if the bear was close. He told her again. She stepped around him. The grizzly had been in the brush between the carcass and the trail the whole time. She came out fast, with no warning. The guide discharged his bear spray at about 10 feet, caught her across the face, and deflected her into the rock outcrop. She recovered in under 2 seconds and reoriented. Harriet was about 6 feet behind him. The bear went straight for her. The first strike was the right forepaw, connecting with the left side of Harriet's head. The force of it put her into the brush off the side of the trail. The bear went in after her. The guide discharged a second burst toward the brush and moved in shouting. The bear paused and turned toward him. He discharged the rest of the canister into her face from close range, and she broke off, moving back in the direction of the carcass. He found Harriet in the brush about 15 seconds later, on the ground, and unresponsive. He activated his emergency beacon immediately. The nearest ground team was 3 hours out by trail, and the cloud ceiling grounded any air response until morning. He stayed with her. She died about 40 minutes after the attack. The forepaw strike had fractured her skull and caused severe bleeding in her brain. That was what killed her. Deep lacerations across the left side of her face and neck, and a separate wound to her abdomen from a follow-up strike were also noted. Surviving that kind of head injury without immediate surgery was not possible, and surgery was 3 hours away at minimum. Her bear spray was found still clipped to her pack, safety tab intact. She never touched it. The beacon log and physical evidence at the scene matched the guide's account. The female grizzly was monitored after, but not destroyed. The death was recorded as accidental, with failure to retreat on direct instruction listed as the primary contributing factor. It was July 14th, 2016, and the early monsoon heat hung over the tourism buffer zone outside a major national park in Rajasthan, India. A safari operation ran jeep excursions through dirt tracks, cutting through dense thorn forest and open grassland. Tiger sightings were the primary draw, attracting international visitors willing to pay premium rates for guided excursions into one of India's most famous predator corridors. Lorenda Fetrick was a 54-year-old luxury travel consultant from Scottsdale, Arizona, who had visited over 40 countries and built a career curating high-end itineraries for wealthy clients. She had developed an unshakable confidence in her ability to manage any travel situation, and an equally firm belief that the rules governing ordinary tourists did not apply to someone with her level of experience. Her arrival at the reserve 3 days earlier had already generated friction with lodge staff. She had demanded a room change on her first night, citing inadequate lighting for her photography equipment, sent back meals twice, and submitted a written complaint about the lodge's wireless internet speed. The morning safari departed at dawn with Fetrick and 3 other guests aboard an open-top Jeep. The air was already thick with humidity, and the dry scrubland shimmered in the early light. The guide, a 43-year-old local man named Rohit Kangar, who held a decade of certification through state authorities, briefed the group that passengers must remain seated at all times and that his navigation decisions were final. After 90 minutes of sambar deer and langur monkeys, Fetrick grew visibly impatient. She approached Kangar and informed him she had not traveled 7,000 miles to photograph deer. She demanded he drive into the reserve's restricted buffer zone, where a breeding female had been reported. Kangar explained that the zone was closed to tourism by authorities, and that entering would jeopardize his certification and the reserve's license. Fetrick told him she would speak to the lodge owner and recommend his replacement with someone more willing to deliver the experience guests were paying for. The other passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. Kangar redirected the Jeep along a secondary track to a shallow ravine where the breeding female had been seen that week. He stopped at a cautious distance along the track and instructed the group to remain still. The tigress was not immediately visible, but alarm calls from langurs in the canopy confirmed her presence. The ravine's thick undergrowth and overlapping thorn scrub made visual confirmation nearly impossible beyond a few yards. Fetrick announced she needed to stretch her legs, swinging one foot over the side of the Jeep before Kangar could react. She dropped to the ground and took several quick steps toward the tree line, camera raised, telling the other passengers she would only be a moment. Kangar moved to follow, but stayed close to the vehicle, shouting and striking the Jeep's metal body to try to drive her back. She was roughly 15 feet from the vehicle when the langur alarm calls stopped abruptly. Bengal tigers are ambush specialists, with adult females typically weighing 220 to 350 pounds and measuring up to 8 feet from nose to tail. They rely on dense cover to close distance before launching attacks in short, explosive bursts. A tigress with cubs is among the most dangerous animals on the planet. Her defensive threshold significantly reduced for any perceived threat entering the vicinity of her young. Tigers are responsible for occasional human fatalities in India, mostly in fringe rural zones where humans and tigers share overlapping territory. The sudden silence lasted less than 2 seconds. Based on ranger assessment and track evidence, the tigress had likely been concealed within close range of where Fetrick stood, her body low and nearly indistinguishable from the dappled shade beneath the thorn scrub. There was no growl, no warning display, no obvious cue an untrained observer would recognize. According to the scene reconstruction conducted by forest rangers, the tigress launched from concealment and closed the distance before Fetrick could turn. The impact drove her to the ground. The tigress dragged Fetrick several yards before retreating into the undergrowth toward her cubs after subduing the threat, the sustained noise from the vehicle likely contributing to her withdrawal. After confirming the tigress had fully withdrawn and waiting nearly a minute to be certain she would not return, Kangar left the Jeep and reached Fetrick. The injuries to her neck and upper body were unsurvivable. He radioed the reserve's central station immediately. Emergency personnel reached the site approximately 35 minutes later. Lorenda Fetrick was pronounced dead at the scene. The subsequent investigation confirmed Fetrick had exited the vehicle against explicit instructions and approached an area with a breeding tigress. Kangar was cleared of liability. The incident was logged with the Regional Wildlife Authority. The reserve temporarily reviewed buffer zone perimeter operations and issued revised passenger safety protocols with stricter guide enforcement measures. It was June 29, 2016, at Folly Beach, South Carolina. The tide had receded, exposing wide stretches of wet sand marked with seaweed, shells, and scattered debris beneath a humid, gray morning sky. Along the rack line, several Portuguese man-of-war lay partially buried and easily mistaken for ordinary jellyfish by casual beachgoers. Tamsin Broyle, 52, had retired 2 years earlier from her job as a school cafeteria supervisor in Somerville after a knee injury ended nearly 2 decades of work. In retirement, she lived a quiet routine focused on gardening, television nature programs, and long conversations with neighbors. Friends described her as self-assured in her opinions, sometimes to the point of dismissing caution when she believed she already understood a situation. She managed mild hypertension with daily lisinopril, but was otherwise independent and active. She had come to the coast for a short weekend trip with her neighbor, Colette Bram, and Colette's husband. It was her first time at the ocean in several years, and she had initially hesitated before agreeing, preferring familiar environments, but eventually accepting the invitation. Portuguese man-of-war aren't actually jellyfish. They're siphonophores, made up of different parts working together like one organism. Even when they're washed up on the beach, their tentacles can still sting. They're covered in tiny stinging cells called nematocysts that can fire on contact, causing sudden, intense pain, angry skin reactions, and sometimes more serious symptoms, depending on how much contact there is and how sensitive the person is. A local man walking his dog passed along the shoreline and warned nearby beachgoers to avoid several washed-up specimens. Most people stepped back. Tamsin, however, moved closer, drawn by curiosity. Colette called out for her to be careful, pointing toward posted warning signs, but Tamsin dismissed the concern, assuming the risk was minimal since the organism was no longer in the water. She crouched beside one specimen that was partially buried in wet sand and reached out to examine it more closely. Believing she was simply observing it, she lifted the translucent float sack with her right hand. From the outside, it looks harmless. In reality, the danger is already on contact, not after. Almost immediately, hidden tentacles beneath the sand and attached to the float made full contact with her wrist and forearm. The movement against the skin triggered multiple simultaneous nematocyst discharges, producing instant, severe burning pain. She dropped the organism within seconds, but exposure had already occurred across a wide area of skin. Within moments, a sharply defined, linear rash appeared along her forearm, following the path of contact. The skin became rapidly inflamed, developing raised welts and patchy swelling. Small fluid-filled blisters began forming along the affected areas as the inflammatory response intensified. The pain escalated quickly, radiating up her arm and becoming difficult to tolerate. Tamsin quickly stood and tried to move away, appearing severely distressed. Within minutes, she became lightheaded, nauseated, and weak, with rapid breathing and sweating consistent with an acute stress response to intense pain. Colette returned briefly with water and found her sitting unsteadily on the sand, pale, confused, and struggling to speak in short phrases. Her breathing was labored, and she was unable to stand without support. Nearby beachgoers assisted while emergency services were called. Her condition continued to deteriorate over several minutes, with increasing drowsiness and reduced responsiveness. She then collapsed onto her side and began vomiting as systemic effects progressed. Even with help nearby, the body can still spiral faster than response times. Before EMS arrived, she lost consciousness as her breathing became irregular and progressed to respiratory failure, followed shortly by cardiac arrest consistent with severe systemic envenomation and physiological stress. Folly Beach EMS arrived promptly, initiated CPR and advanced life support on the shoreline, and continued resuscitation during transport to MUSC Health Colleton Medical Center. Despite prolonged efforts, Tamsin Broyle was pronounced dead later that morning. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest following severe systemic reaction to Portuguese man-of-war envenomation, with hypertension and acute stress response as contributing factors. The case was classified as a rare, severe, toxic reaction to marine cnidarian exposure, with evidence of severe systemic inflammatory and cardiovascular reaction following extensive envenomation. Following the incident, local authorities issued a public advisory regarding Portuguese man-of-war sightings along the coast that week and reinforced warning signage in affected beach areas. It was August 3rd, 2015. The Reptile Facility was a small, privately run attraction on the outskirts of a rural town in northern Queensland, Australia. It had been operating for several years, drawing tourists passing through the region who wanted a close look at some of the largest reptile species in the world. Glorine Taft was 51 years old. She was a retired school administrator from Tucson, Arizona, and she had driven nearly 3 hours with her adult daughter to visit the facility as part of a self-planned road trip. Glorine was the kind of person who had spent decades running buildings full of people and never really switched that off. She questioned the no-flash photography rule within the first 20 minutes of arriving. She complained to a second staff member about the feeding schedule not being convenient enough for visiting guests, and said she thought the rule was unnecessary. She was 20 minutes in and already running the place in her head. The enclosure at the end of the corridor held a single adult male saltwater crocodile, estimated at around 14 feet in length and close to 1,000 pounds. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile species on Earth and are responsible for more fatal attacks on humans than any other crocodilian. They are ambush predators with a bite force that exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inch, the strongest of any living animal. At close range, the strike is essentially instantaneous. The feeding slot built into the lower section of the enclosure wall was a narrow opening used exclusively by trained staff. It was designed to pass food through and nothing else. The scheduled feeding had taken place at 11 UAM. Saltwater crocodiles remain highly alert near the feeding wall for a significant period after a feeding session. A sign posted directly above the slot stated this clearly. Glorine had watched the feeding from the viewing rail. When it was over, she went up to a staff member and asked if she could feed the animal herself. She was told the session was done and that guests did not take part in the feedings. She rephrased the request, made it sound like a small thing, and asked again. The answer was the same. The staff member walked away. At 11:34 a.m., Glorine walked back to the enclosure on her own. Can you imagine being that convinced you knew better than everyone working there? The slot in the enclosure wall was covered by a hinged metal plate that closed with a simple hand-turn latch. It was built for staff to use quickly during feeding sessions, and nobody had ever thought to make it harder to open because walking back there alone was not something anyone expected a visitor to do. Glorine reached into her bag, took out a piece of food she had picked up from the facility cafe earlier, and pushed her right arm through the opening up to about mid-forearm. The crocodile had not moved far from the wall since the morning feeding. He struck before her arm had fully cleared the opening. The bite closed around her forearm, and the momentum of the strike drove her body forward into the concrete wall with enough force to dislocate her right shoulder on impact. The slot geometry prevented the animal from executing a full lateral roll, but the grip held completely. He did not release. Her daughter was standing about 15 feet back when it happened. Staff responded quickly, but the facility ran a single handler shift on weekday mornings, and the intervention kit was stored in the rear handling area rather than staged at the enclosure. Retrieving it took around 4 minutes. The crocodile let go when staff got in through the upper enclosure access. By that point, Glorine had already lost consciousness against the wall. Emergency services were called immediately, but given the rural location, they took around 22 minutes to arrive. Glorine Taft was pronounced dead at the scene. The post-mortem found the bite had crushed most of the bone in her right forearm and severed the major blood vessels. She bled out before help could reach her. Security footage confirmed she opened the cover herself. The case was ruled accidental death. No staff member was found at fault. The hand-turn fastener was replaced with a keyed lock.